3 tips for a rock solid cancellation agreement this week on the podcast.
This is the Wedding Industry Law Podcast, a podcast dedicated to wedding professionals that are just trying to keep it legal. And now, your host, Rob Shank.
Hey out there, welcome back. Glad that you could join me. Today on the podcast, we're going to be talking about 3 tips for a rock solid cancellation agreement, what a cancellation agreement actually is, how it functions, and when it is appropriate. But before we get into that, we are asking you, I don't know why I just said we, the royal we. I am asking you, I implore you, I'm on my knees begging you to go to Wedding Industry Law on YouTube, hit subscribe there, or like and subscribe to this podcast wherever you get it from. But the bonus about going to YouTube is that there's more content there than just this podcast. So little videos that have little tiny helpful things in it, hot takes on legal issues, all that and more over at Wedding Industry Law on YouTube. Like and subscribe. Let's get into the podcast. A cancellation agreement is the document that memorializes the obligations of the client and the vendor moving forward when a service contract has been terminated. A cancellation agreement is typically done when a client wants out of the contract and the client wants out and there's no dispute about it. In other words, there's no animosity. You're not throwing, things across the room at your client and vice versa. It's an amicable situation. Client's spouse is cheating. They found a better deal across town. Whatever the case may be, the cancellation agreement is appropriate when there's no problems, no serious problems. So that's when the cancellation agreement typically is executed between the parties. So the client emails the vendor, hey, I went out. Okay, great. That's typically when the cancellation agreement is going to be used. So what does the cancellation agreement do that your service contract doesn't cover? That's an excellent question, Rob. So let's start with the former. What does a cancellation agreement do? The cancellation agreement essentially functions as a release. In other words, it's going to tell the world that the client wants out. The parties want out. The original contract is no more. It's dead. It's ceased to be. The cancellation agreement is also going to act as a release. It's going to say, hey, I don't expect me to be at your wedding on November 30th. I won't be there. We've terminated. Okay. It just tells the world nothing else is going to happen. That's what the cancellation agreement in a nutshell does. So is that necessary? Like, why doesn't the email that you got from the client function as the cancellation agreement? And I'm here to tell you that often it does. The email does function to tell the world that there is none. So the cancellation agreement is essentially Linus's blanket. It is an insurance policy. It is a cloak that makes you feel good. It's a Snuggie that tells the world in more direct fashion than an email that the contract is no more. That if you're not going to get a call November 30th that says, hey, where are you? And you're like, well, I got that email. Oh, no, we took that back. Don't you remember? No. That's what the cancellation agreement in a nutshell is designed to do. So your service contract cannot really address that issue. And that's why the cancellation agreement is important, at least in that respect. So it's telling the world no more contract. Everybody's agreed to that. Acts as kind of an insurance policy for you so that you don't get sued for not showing up to a thing that you thought was done. How does that work? So you get an email from the client and the client's like, done. You're like, okay, sayonara. Oh, by the way, sign this. Sometimes that can be a little hard to do. I don't know. You tell me, right in the comments. Have you ever sent a cancellation agreement to a client and they won't sign it or they go away? And they could. Why should they? right? What's the incentive to sign something unless they're going to get something? A lot of times, almost all the times, that's what a contract needs to be enforceable. It's called consideration. You can't just say, hey, sign this. They need to be getting something for it. So often, if you don't have something to go with that cancellation agreement, you're probably not going to have the client's probably not going to sign it, right? And so then you're back to relying on an email to function as the termination of the contract and the words of the words of the service contract, right? So oftentimes what I see clients do is, here's a little bit back, or here's, some bit of service that you got, blah, blah, blah. Or if you want pictures, if you want the final product or whatever, sign this cancellation agreement. And that's the consideration. Sign this cancellation agreement. They sign the cancellation agreement, you put it in the file, you go forward. So in the event that you're able to get the client to sign the cancellation agreement, okay, in exchange for whatever, or if they just do it, that's fine. They're agreeing to it. There are going to be 3 things that I want you to address in that cancellation agreement to make it super, super duper tight, super duper rock solid. Okay. The first one is money. You need to make sure that the contract specifies what is happening, if anything, to money that was paid to you in the original contract or that might be owed to you in the original contract. So is there going to be a refund? Do they still owe you? Is there still some type of service that needs to be rendered? Take care of all of that within your cancellation agreement. It's going to be super important, because once you have a cancellation agreement, if it's a good one, then the service contract terms are no more. The only agreement between you and that client, theoretically, is going to be the cancellation agreement. Does that make sense? So you essentially are signing something that terminates and dissolves the previous. So you want to make sure that if there's any question about what happens to your services, it is addressed in the cancellation agreement. I will give you $50 in 2 weeks in the form of a check, or whatever the case may be. Make sure that you address who gets it when, under what circumstances. The second thing is, again, deal with the release. In other words, your cancellation agreement needs to specify that the original contract is terminated. And because the original contract is terminated, I, the vendor, will have no more obligations to the client for any reason under that service contract. Now, that's not just saying I don't have to do anything anymore. You want to make sure that your release in the cancellation agreement also says that I'm not responsible for anything to the extent that I mess anything up until the point where we sign the cancellation agreement. A release of claims, essentially. So a release of obligations and claims in your cancellation agreement, referencing the original contract. Okay. The third thing that I recommend, and again, these are things that are on top of other critical elements of any contract, okay? And we'll talk about those in other episodes, but these are specific to cancellation agreements. So obviously you're going to want to have a place where you sign your name, right? I'm just not getting into that. I'm talking about 3 things specific to cancellation agreements. So the third one is important to the extent that it is mom that has signed the contract. And that is an obligation for the party signing the cancellation agreement to inform the beneficiaries that you're not going to show up on November 30th with your camera. In other words, to the extent that the couple has not been involved in the contract signing, you're obligating whoever is signing it that they're going to inform the beneficiaries, the couple, that they're not receiving services. You're obligating that person to tell them. It's not like you got to go, because it might be they don't know what their mom is doing. They don't know that their mom has canceled you. And then they're going to be mad when you don't show up on November 30th. So obligating the person to notify the beneficiaries of the original service contract. Deal with money, release yourself from the obligations, and obligation to tell the beneficiaries of the service contract. Those are the three primary things, other than the fact that you want to have language that says the termination, the original contract is terminated. Like I said, other things that are important, but these are things that you might leave out. So that's going to do it for this particular episode. If you enjoyed the content of this episode, please like and subscribe wherever you get your podcast from, and be sure to go to Wedding Industry Law on our YouTube channel. Subscribe there. We would love to have you. Leave a comment while you do. And with that, we'll see you next week.
Thank you for listening to the Wedding Industry Law Podcast. This podcast is intended for general information only. Nothing in this podcast is intended to be legal advice. Do not rely on this podcast for your legal matter. Instead, consult an attorney in your area. Thanks, obrigada, até semana que vem.